couple of guys in suits were just up here.
I saw. Yeah,
That's kind of the direction we're heading. It seems like we're talking about Interop, and so connecting blockchains is still it's still very much a crypto native concept.
yes, very much so. And the name of this panel, right? The land of 1,000 chains. I think if you talk to a lot of people, even just 2 years ago, the landscape of what 1,000 plus chains would look like, we would probably imagine it as something being more driven by new crypto companies. I think now with how the market structure is shifting, you could very well see the majority of that composition as you get closer to the end of this decade, those being chains built by people in suits, and presumably that's a good thing. I think myself it's a good thing. When you think of the needs call it a Fortune 500 company that wants to operate on chain would have, them having their own environment almost makes more sense than operating on public chain number 17. Certainly operating on Ethereum, you see that happening already today in scale. You see some of it happening on Solana. But when it comes to, right, like, what about public chain number 17? They might as well do their own and have much more control over that environment. In a way, it's kind of an extension of, in 2015, there was this notion of the Ethereum Enterprise Alliance. And then you got companies like R3, or I think the company was Corda, whatever it was called, trying to build these enterprise chains. And that didn't take off at the time, but now it might.
So I think you're answering why we have 1,000 chains. Do we need any more? And I think we're seeing this tendency in AI as well. And I don't want to bring in too many more buzzwords, but these companies are launching their own models because they're building something that maybe needs to be compliant, or they're going to fine tune it themselves and run it locally. And I think there is a similar infrastructure development in crypto once the value proposition is realized to ultimately take control of more and more of the stack. And so this is an argument for modularization, app chains, proliferation of more and more chains, multi-chain world. And so I think there's probably no disagreement that we will have several chains, lots of chains, and just increasingly more. And value may flow and accumulate to and consolidate within those. But ultimately, the idea of sovereign block space is one that most companies tend to agree with. Okay, so once we have the prerequisite of multi-chain, then it becomes a question of how we connect these together. There's several approaches. Wormhole was just up here. We have John from Hyperlane, Nick from Across representing more of a cross-chain intense paradigm. John, you guys have done some work with Celestia and lazy bridging. There's some ZK work in there as well. And so I'm curious the argument from both sides. Maybe we'll hear from each of you an argument for intense, an argument for maybe lazy bridging or mailboxes. And then we'll kind of compare and contrast the two. Maybe there's similarities and differences, but also there's fertile ground for where something makes sense on that side of the spectrum versus the other side of the spectrum. So, Nick, would you like to start with intense?
Yeah, I'll go first. First of all, I think John and I are probably on the same page. We probably actually we collaborate more than we really are rivals. I think we actually build on top of Hyperlane. For example, the XERC20 standard or OFTs, which is Stargate's standard, we, into all intense protocols like Across, have to build on top of these message boxes. You have to use the message box as an underlying message layer. And then intents are really just a marketplace on top of that. So I think this is the natural way that these bridges are going to be built, because intents allow competition, and we've seen that we get the best prices and the most speed because relayers are really profit incentivized to be very fast. The relayer landscape now is incredibly competitive, and it's just full of very professional market makers. It's really impressive. but intents would not be possible without protocols like Hyperlane. Yeah, I'm curious what you think, John.
I think this is going to be very boring, but I agree with a lot of what you said, and I think there's this dichotomy that kind of emerges in how people talk about it, which is these two things are very different. And now, like, what is, like, Nick, no offense, I hate the use of the term intent because it, like, sounds like something really complex, and really just like, I want to do something. Today, I had the intent of arriving here and speaking on this thing. And in the context that we use intents on chain, it's basically like, I have this asset here, and I would like to end up with this asset over there. And, Across has been, I mean, even if it's not technically the first one to realize it, it certainly was the first one to do something about it, and has become...
To name it, you mean?
Really, too?
No, I thought that's what you were referring
to.
to.
Oh, no. Not in the naming, not in respect to naming, just in terms of like commercializing it, making a real product around it, and making it a real dominant force in the market. Today, wherever it's available, it is usually the best option. I'm a big user myself. And so as I think about where are these things useful, so where the assets already exist, then using intents is the best path forward, right? Because if you're trying to introduce some type of like new messaging way to move assets where assets already exist, well, that's a distinct token contract, and now you're going to have, right, like additional fragmentation. You're going to have, like, you need to battle your way to make your new token representation usurp the one that already exists. That's very difficult, and no one really wants to do that. And so wherever assets already exist, and that's why now in 2025 today, where you've seen like there's a proliferation of different interop protocols, they're being used a ton. Well, something like intents or intents directly are still the dominant form on chains that existed prior to the wave of interop. So call it 8 to 10 biggest chains, almost all of the flows that happen in their major assets that are cross-chain are facilitated by intents. And so I don't see any way where you have a better system than that, right? Now, if you're going to a new chain, as you will in many cases in this thousands of chains kind of future that we're talking about, there's less of a fight. There's no tokens that exist yet. And then if you can be the token representation that will be the dominant one, then skipping the need for effectively a form of a market maker to use their inventory and have to know how to deal with that and deal with the pricing. Now messaging is like it's a path of less friction. There, where something like an intent would be useful is if you want to make it a multi-hop step. So like, I want to start with ETH from base, and I want to end up with like a stable coin on, call it JP Morgan's chain that they'll have by 2029, right? So the intent is like that last step.
Well, let's say, okay, let's take that scenario. Let's say there's a brand new chain, and we see this every day. There's a brand new chain, and I often see it like a race between the market makers getting liquidity onto that new chain and the messaging network like Hyperlane building an adapter to get to that chain. It's really a race, I think, and I think it's only a matter of time until the market makers will eventually get there, and then the market makers are going to dominate in a very specific subset of transfers, which I think intents actually only really work in the sub 10 second transfer window. Like anything more than say like 30 seconds really, native bridges are always going to dominate. Like as a user, if I'm willing to wait a minute, I'm just going to use the native bridge because it's free. It's as cheap as can be. But if I'm really urgent because I'm making a trade or I'm closing an arbitrage trade, I'm going to use intents. And I think that's actually where intents are going. Like internally at Across, we're actually pretty much only tracking the smaller transfers. Yeah, like only under like $20,000 or so. And we really just focus on the speed there.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And in this world where this race does exist, we see it all the time, right? Like both of us. It'll be interesting to see how many of those market makers just realize like, oh wait, I can kind of cut my cost by using the messaging path for like the first leg of my transfer, and then I bring my inventory to facilitate the second one, which also might be the more lucrative one, right? Like if someone's just moving ETH to ETH in kind of like a well-trodden path, maybe that's not where the money's made. But if they want to switch that ETH to, I don't know, Fartcoin, might be a little more volatility there and a higher willingness to deal with a big spread.
They do that actually. I think that's what we do also when we run one of our relayers. It's basically a time arbitrage. You're trading off a market maker is willing to hold inventory for a couple hours, and they're willing to lend money to users who only want to wait an hour, and they're basically clipping that 1 hour opportunity cost of capital, which is pretty small, but if you do that volume, it can be profitable over time. And there's no price risk, so it's a pretty good arbitrage.
No, totally. Yeah, the thing that we found is that's like their main consideration is how fast can I do this? What does that mean for my inventory turnaround time? And that when we try to convince folks to, all right, hey, you're doing a lot of solving for intents between, say, like Base and Solana. How about you do it for this new chain that is launching next week? And then it's like, well, my hurdle rate looks like, call it, 27% annualized. So they need to make a sort of like, almost like a venture-like projection over how much traffic is this chain going to have, and do I basically like get to earn my hurdle rate or more by committing a piece of my inventory? And so it's been it's hard to get them to make those bets because what they're doing today is so lucrative for them. It's been basically getting solvers to go to the frontier of chains has been, in my experience, like a very difficult task.
And there's actually a bunch of profit to be made in those first 30 days, I would say, when the chain gets live, because let's say there are not many native bridges. There are not many fast bridges out of a new chain. And let's say a new chain X has just launched. The best way out of there is usually you have to take the 7-day bridge or something very slow. Now, 7 days on a brand new chain, you're basically looking at 5 to 10% rug risk, like some other chance of just totally losing your funds. So you're getting paid a lot on these new chains. You're getting paid probably over 100% annualized on that first 30 days. So there's a lot of alpha to be made in just being able to launch on, or as a market maker, get to new chains quickly, serve all the volume until everyone else catches up to you, then move on to new pastures.
Yeah. 100%.
So a market maker is going to use something like a native bridge in order to get there first, deploy the liquidity that a solver can then tap in, the intent bridge can then tap into.
Exactly. And then this market maker will just say be a solver on a cross for maybe 30 days until this chain, until other fast bridges launch. And then once more fast bridges, and then maybe Binance or Bybit serve, then all the alpha is gone. All the profits are gone at that point.
Got it. So you guys at Across, but also several other teams, Hyperlane may have been involved in this as well, but it's primarily an EVM thing, which is 7683. I'm curious how that's been going, because that had a strong push, garnered a lot of traction amongst the Ethereum ecosystem in particular. Could you give us kind of a catch up on the last few months, how 7683 has progressed?
Yeah, so 7683 I think has been supported by a few partners. So most notably Optimism, Uniswap, and Across. So we have basically an API right now where we're allowing people to submit 7683 orders, and then solvers will respond to that and fill it. And it's kind of in a testing phase right now because relayers still need to, I guess, write their code to adapt to this new order type. They have to change their code internally. So it's been a little bit, it's been gradual, I will say. But I think the idea is once more auctions and more APIs are built to distribute 7683 orders, then relayers will come on board once they see that, oh, there's all this volume they can serve. Relayers really respond to the volume. So I think once 7683 orders start to proliferate more, then the solvers will come online.
Got it. And kind of hopping back to the previous point about like a solver launching, some liquidity on a new chain via native bridge and then tapping into that with intent-based bridges. Do you think with some of the new chains that come online, especially the ones that, now it is really easy to launch a chain, but I think most of the new chains are the companies that are looking to prioritize their own block space, right? And so are they not already coming on and deploying some initial liquidity onto their chain and theoretically could use that for the intent-based bridges? So does this not, and this is great for intent-based bridges, right? Because the liquidity exists there. Where is that, like after the alpha gets compressed, is there enough spread in order to continue to serve that market when maybe there's another opportunity for that capital elsewhere? Or is the risk so low that it's essentially a risk-free rate return in crypto?
Yeah, I think it's basically a risk-free rate plus some spread because it's a new chain. There's less liquidity, there's more risk. But that's why over time, eventually, the more institutional market makers or fillers are going to take most of the bridging volume. It's really like, I guess if you remember back in DeFi summer, every time there was a new farm, like hobbyists like us could go onto this new farm and you could pretty easily earn a lot very quickly. But then once you're over time, you just get eaten up by the institutional market makers. So I think it's the same thing.
Yeah, and if you think about it, so as we've tried to see more of this get off the ground, right, and like our bread and butter is dealing with new chains. From the solver, market maker perspective, whatever we want to call them, the costs are mostly front loaded, and like so you have these fixed costs at the beginning of like how much effort is it to now support this new chain, right? Like from a technology perspective. What type of infrastructure do I need to stand up to be able to do what I've been doing everywhere else to do it also here? Then cases where you have something like a cross already there, that simplifies that burden like meaningfully, and that's why it's always preferable for them. Like, how can I do this for less cost, right? Do I have to commit my engineering team to? Is this like a 4-engineer 4-week endeavor, or is this a 2-engineer like 4-day thing? That makes a massive delta. So once that cost has been kind of taken care of, the only type of variable cost that would influence what you were talking about, whether this is kind of like a risk-free trade or not, is what is my inventory turnaround time. So I need to have some amount of inventory on that chain to be able to fill that order, right? If I want to fill it, like, when you use a cross and it works really well, a lot of times you get filled like under a second, basically. And for that to happen, that inventory needs to be there and needs to be sent to your address basically like imminently. And so what influences my inventory turnaround time? Okay, now if I need to rebalance, say if I have like $1 million on Robbie's new chain, right? Like the roll-up meta chain. Well, if I now need to go pull that inventory somewhere else, how long does that take to get off? What's the, what influences that? And the shorter that time is, the higher the willingness to commit inventory, because its commitment is basically like the function of how committed you are is how long does it take to get out, right? If it takes 7 days to get out, okay, now we have some type of issue. If it takes, 7 hours or 7 minutes, those are all effectively like order of magnitude reductions to the cost that you face. And the closer that time gets to zero, the easier it is to really like treat all these things as like totally liquid. If your liquidity can actually move between this vast array of chains on a shorter and shorter time scale, like now you're not so worried about the cost because you're really not super committed. At the moment that chain stops being a profit center for you. You move somewhere else, right? Your inventory is not locked up, and then you can earn above your hurdle rate, and you can basically utilize your inventory in the most efficient way. But so if you're one of these people, like what makes this a risk-free trade for you? There's the initial cost, the upfront cost of just getting started, and then there's the ongoing cost of like how long is my inventory tied up for, and can I modulate that effectively and quickly?
And that question of how long, that is bounded by the native bridge.
It's bounded by whatever mints the asset.
Whatever mints the asset.
So if the native bridge, basically, so think of them as, a lot of times, native bridge is historically been used to mean like the roll-up bridge, like the optimistic bridge in most cases, because that was the thing through which most assets were minted. But what bounds it is like the settlement time of the thing that mints that specific asset. So like take for, I'll use like one example is, we just started working with USD-HL, like the new stablecoin for the hyperliquid EVM. And so there, right, like effectively the native bridge for that asset specifically runs through Hyperlane. So like if you wanted to be a solver for that, well, now your turnaround time is basically 30 seconds or less. So if you're going to put, say, $1 million of inventory to market make for USDHL and like fill intent orders, the moment that you decide that that's no longer an effective or interesting thing to do, take it back somewhere else, right? The commitment that you're looking at is basically a 30 to 60 second kind of commitment. Then you have other cases where the asset, like take for instance, ETH on base. Well, that goes to the roll-up bridge. So for the largest amount that you'll want to withdraw, now you're looking at like the 7-day withdrawal period. But beneath that, you could probably leverage someone else's liquidity through something like a cross. And so that also has an impact on your settlement time. And you could use something like Binance or any exchange that'll let you basically withdraw at a faster turnaround time than 7 days.
Part of the reason I ask is because I'm curious how much ZK proofs are playing a role in Interop these days.
Right now, very little,
Right.
but that'll change.
Because ZK will get faster to prove and verify, and therefore reduce the time that
Exactly,
the native
yeah.
that it takes to mint the asset on the destination.
Yeah, the moment in time where you have ZK proofs that are performant enough, and by performant I would say like the two vectors you're looking at are how expensive is it in like computation units and gas to generate that proof, and then how long does it take to do that. Once that can be done like end to end, call it at under 10 seconds, I don't see any reason why you would use something like a non-ZK based, native bridge.
Right.
And now that unlocks a shitload, much more than even people, think about, because unless you're in the weeds in this, unless you are someone like Nick, someone like us, or one of the people that we're talking about, these market makers, you don't really think about the impact that reducing the turnaround time will have for like the liquidity of liquidity. Like how liquid is this liquidity?
So taking each of those in turn, the first one, well, the how long question, we hear a lot about ZK, like, okay, well, we just had real-time proving sort of that milestone on Ethereum. We can kind of generate proofs in under 12 seconds, right? So we meet the block time of Ethereum. The cost, I don't hear about as much. And so I'm curious when it comes to the cost of generating a ZK proof versus the cost of capital to front for a filled transaction cross-chain. Do you guys have any insight? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm curious how those two costs stack up.
Well, I guess it depends on the proving system. But what I'll say is like what you could still have is like somewhere, on the long road, which I don't think is that long, is somewhere like definitely this decade, I think most likely somewhere before like 2028, where these things will be efficient enough. But on the road to that, you could see a world where like, the transfer at home might still, not find the cost like appealing enough to use it, but that the industrial transfer, right? Where like, okay, yeah, maybe this makes it $20, $30 more expensive, but that's cost that doesn't scale with the content of the transaction. And so like the cost of the proof doesn't change much whether you're moving, you know, 1 token or 100 million tokens. And so at that point, like, well, all right, if this is the difference, you know, if me paying this, call it $30 cost, let's say, is going to save me a ton of time, which then influences how much I can generate from my inventory, then I still see people will use that.
I think it's already less than like $30. I think it's
Oh, yeah.
like well under that. Like
Oh, it
maybe
definitely is.
maybe like dollars, less than dollars.
Yeah.
Even on mainnet, or mainnet's a little bit more expensive. But I also think 10 seconds for a proof is a little bit. I don't know when that's gonna happen. That might be pretty far in the future.
Wow. I hope I'm wrong. I hope.
Well, I think you can generate a proof in 10 seconds, but realistically, these proofs are getting batch proven to save costs. So you're looking at more like probably on the order of minutes to get your like proof in. So let's say over time, native bridges become on the order of like 10 minutes fast. That still gives plenty of room for like fast bridges to have some market share, but over time, like that share is going to compress and compress and compress, and you're probably going to see all the profitable opportunities are really just supporting new chains at launch that maybe don't have like a ZK proving system yet. You're just like providing like a temporary, I guess, liquidity exit for users on that new chain until they get their full ZK system up and running, which I think like, I don't know, it's kind of similar, I guess, to many fintech businesses where for the most part, the margins are tiny and you're making a lot of profits on just like an edge case, like that keeps popping up here or there.
Yeah. No, totally. Yeah, the other thing we didn't talk about is basically like the, you know, so it's how expensive the proof is, how fast can you generate. So like, is it everywhere you need it to be? Which is, you know, right now, even where they are, you know, performant enough, they're not available in that many places because, you know, you need to prove that something happened to that specific block space.
Right. I think that is more, and I might be getting out over my skis here, but I think that's more issue on the verification side because as I understand it, you can send a proof up to you can essentially leverage a proof generation service like a RISC-0 or SB1. It's necessary to have a verification, a verifier of that ZK proof on the destination chain. And so it's like how extensible are the verification systems?
Yeah, it also depends on which VM you're proving the state on. So like today you could take any Ethereum state and you could prove it on basically any chain you want to. You could take any random chain and say, oh, this happened on Ethereum, which is very useful if you're going from Ethereum to a different chain. But to go the other way, let's say one of the new chains like Monad, I don't know what the state of their ZK proving system is, but because their VM is different, they're likely going to have to work with like teams like Succinct to create new circuits. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think like it's the hard part for the industry, but it's a good thing for people like Nick and I, where the fragmentation happened. Like everyone talks about the fragmentation between chains, but there's also like a non-trivial. I mean, it's the most difficult part of this fragmentation is along the VM lines. And if you look at like, okay, on-chain activity today, which is primarily, you know, financially oriented, trading and other DeFi use cases, it's fractured, you know, basically between about 4 chains, but 3 different VM lines, right? So it happens majority between ETH, Base, Solana, and Hyperliquid, and now you've crossed 3 different virtual machines, and it's that difficulty that, you know, if they were all the same, then yeah, it would be much easier for even the chain teams to create things that basically like absolve the needs for things like Across, for things like Hyperlane. But because this is a extremely difficult thing to deal with, you know, a difficulty that we deal with basically like every day, it makes services like ours more useful. And if you think about this world where okay, so blockchains are useful, people use them, there's a ton of financial activity that happens on them. I think earlier in June marked the highest point ever for the percent of trading that happened on chain as a total of all crypto trading. I think it reached something along the low 30s, which was like an all-time high. Well, how do you, if you're gonna, now there's a lot of talk about new order books coming on chain. Well, how do you differentiate, right? And so you have to either differentiate with some new distribution method, which is really hard to do as a new entrant. And so you're going to gravitate towards something like differentiating on product features or product capabilities. And more often than not, that's going to drive you to try and make VM level changes. And so I don't see the incentives are not going to let this fragmentation slow down, which again, good for business.
I'm curious, as you guys sort of think through this progression here and you look to differentiate, and this is a non-technical question, so kind of just shifting gears as we wind down, how much have you brought focus into the front end as we have AI agents, and are you guys optimizing for kind of the machine-to-machine economy, or are you still optimizing for a user going to a bridge front end, clicking through the buttons flow and going through it that way? Where do you guys focus these days?
Yeah, I have some insight into this because we track our flows pretty closely, and most users today still go through front ends. I think it's because cross-chain is inherently dangerous. It feels dangerous when you send transactions from one chain and then your money disappears and you don't know where it goes. There's no easy way to track it inherently, and that's never going to be solved. So it's
Can we get in a cross scan so that we know, okay, this is where this thing is, while it's going through the portal?
No, totally. We on our across front end, we have our own tracking, but it's something that we have invested a lot into and are constantly working on because I think cross-chain just feels so shady, so dangerous. But so I do think cross-chain, the front ends are always going to be very important. And if you're scared about using a front end sending cross-chain, imagine sending a bridge via an API. It'd be terrifying. So I do think front ends will always serve a purpose in the cross-chain world.
Yeah. If you don't mind sharing just real quick, I'm curious, do you have a breakdown of the flows, just 50-50, 70-30?
No, it's much closer to 70-30. It's a lot through the front ends. And if not our front end, then an aggregator like Socket or Li-Fi.
Yeah, honestly, even 70-30 is lower than I would have expected it to be, over 80, yeah. I'll say, from our part, we've more focused. We focus less on front end and more on call it, want to call it machine. I don't think it's many machines doing it just yet, but it is mostly meant for developers, and maybe that'll change because I think what is clear is why is a person bridging in the first place? No one wants to perform that act. It's an annoying act to do. If you had to bridge in the non-crypto world, it's when you'd go to buy something on Amazon, and then your bank is Chase Chain, and then you need to use a bridging app that's your Visa card and get your money over to Bezos Chain, where you might have to convert to Bezos bucks, and hopefully there's some nifty way to do that abstracts that for you, right? No one wants to do that. The reason you're bridging is because there's something you want to do on that destination. There's an asset you want to buy. There's an app you want to interact with. And so I think the evolution of bridging front ends is ending up looking a lot more like trading interfaces of some sort, because that is really what the motivating reason is to be bridging in the first place.
I think we already see that. Maybe Uniswap has that even on a cross front end. There are some instances of that already. Cool, guys. Thanks so much. We're out of time. Appreciate it, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.